All right, so in this video, I want to tackle one of the most common questions that comes up as people are investigating franchise opportunities. And that question is, should I look at doing multiple locations or starting with one, seeing how it goes, and then decide whether or not to expand into multiple locations? So want to just kind of set the frame here for what I really want to focus on in this video, which is more specific to brick and mortar franchise concepts, right? So in your service based franchise models, they're going to be more territory based, where you don't have a storefront or a customer facing location. That's a little bit different than what we're going to talk about today. It's still very common in those types of service models that people do secure more than one territory up front when deciding to move forward with the franchise. But that typically looks a little bit different than what I want to really focus on today, which is more of what's typically referred to as a multi-unit development agreement, again, specific to brick and mortar storefront concepts. So that's what I'm going to kind of lay out because it's a big consideration, right? It can feel very overwhelming initially as you're starting to, research a franchise and really learn, about the business. But then at some point you have to, start looking at, is this something I want to just start with one location, get that location open, see how things are going, and then at some point in the future decide if I want to expand into multiple locations, or do I want to secure multiple locations up front? And if so, what does that look like? So I'm going to kind of break down the pros and cons of starting with one, seeing how it goes, and then looking at expanding versus securing the rights to develop multiple locations up front, and then what that typically looks like. So one of the biggest questions I think that most people have when they start thinking about multiple locations, and throughout this video, I'm going to kind of use the example of, when we talk about multi-unit development agreements, use the example of 3 locations because that's fairly common in the types of franchises that I primarily work with. You see people very often investing in securing 3 locations up front. Obviously, it varies based on the individual. It varies based on the brand, the investment range. I mean, there's a lot of things that factor in, but 3 locations is pretty common in a lot of these brick and mortar storefront models. I'm mostly working with non-food franchises. Okay. So one of the most common questions is, okay, well, if I'm deciding to start by securing the rights to develop 3 locations, does that mean I'm simultaneously trying to open 3 locations? Which is a great question. Naturally, it's overwhelming, for most people to think about, especially if they're coming into a franchise where it's a business they haven't owned before. A lot of people buying franchises have never had to navigate, finding commercial real estate, negotiating leases, managing a build out with a general contractor and subcontractors and everything that goes into that. So I want to kind of break this down so people understand, what does that typically look like realistically. And I think once you kind of understand that, it'll be more clear to you why it is fairly common that people secure multiple locations up front. And if it's a good franchise organization, why that shouldn't be so overwhelming to think about taking that approach. But there's pros and cons to it. So we're going to talk about some of the cons or some of the reasons that someone may not want to do a multi-unit development agreement up front as well. So first, let's kind of define what is a multi-unit development agreement. It's essentially an agreement between you and the franchisor that you will open a specific number of locations within a defined territory and timeline. All right. So instead of purchasing just one location up front, you're securing the rights to develop multiple locations within a market. For example, you might commit to developing 3 Pilates studios within your territory. And in exchange for that, the franchisor is going to reserve that territory for you, meaning no one else is going to be able to come in and open that same franchise within the territory that you've secured. All right. So rather than just buying one business, you're securing the opportunity to build a small network of these locations or these studios over time. All right. So, what are the pros of multi unit development? What are some of the reasons that people will commonly opt to go this route? There's several kind of main advantages for why you see someone going the multiple unit route. The first one is to protect prime territory, right? We have kind of a saying, in franchising, those of us that have been in the space for a long time, and there's exceptions to this, but it largely holds true, which is, once a franchise brand is kind of a household name and everyone knows about it, whether that's from a consumer standpoint or, people looking at franchises, what are some of the quote unquote hot franchise opportunities out there? Once it's kind of a household name, it's likely in most markets going to be too late to get in as a franchisee, especially when it comes to prime territories. So, again, there's exceptions to this, but you take a brand like Orange Theory, right? Most people are going to be familiar with that brand, or a Club Pilates. Virtually impossible to find available territory throughout the U.S. at this point in time, because those brands have, been in development for so long. They have a great track record of franchisee success, and so any territory that would be available is likely not very desirable territory. It's kind of the scraps that are left over that the other franchisees in a market that are already up and operating have opted, they don't want to develop in those territories. So that's a big consideration for people that are looking at a franchise and planning to secure multiple locations up front, is they want to protect prime territory. So, because again, with the multi-unit development agreements, you're purchasing the rights to develop X number of locations. I'm going to kind of use 3 locations throughout this example because, again, that's fairly common. But you're essentially ensuring your ability to scale, right, to expand your business in a certain area, right? So that's one of the big reasons. Another reason is, there is some economic advantage to doing so, in that most franchisors have a tiered, discounted pricing model on the initial franchise fees. All right. So the initial franchise fees in any franchise are going to be, an upfront one-time fee that you pay to the franchisor. And that's essentially, it gets you access to everything that a franchisee gets, the playbook, the training, the systems, the support, the ability to use the branding and trademarks and everything that comes with that. But it's also, in most franchises, securing your protected territory, right? So again, there are exceptions to this. Not every franchise out there uses a protected territory model, but the vast majority of them do, especially if we're talking brick and mortar storefront models like I'm really referring to today. Once you own an area, the franchisor is agreeing to not open another location of that same brand within a certain distance of your location, as long as you're holding to everything in the franchise agreement that you're responsible for as a franchisee. We'll get right back to the episode in just a minute, but if you've been considering business ownership, if you're already a business owner looking to expand and you're curious about franchising, I'd love to connect with you, answer any initial questions that you have, talk about a specific franchise, and detail the exact process that I use and have taken hundreds of people through to help them understand franchise ownership, find the right franchise for them, and conduct the necessary due diligence. Click the link in the show notes if you'd like to schedule a free, no obligation strategy call. I look forward to talking with you. And now back to the episode. All right. So a common example, just to kind of give you some context with the numbers on the initial franchise fee. And the franchise fees do vary a bit from one brand to the next, but generally speaking, they're all pretty close to each other. So a common example would be, the franchise fee for your first territory is $60,000, right? So the way the discounted tier might work is that if you commit to doing 2 locations up front, then the franchise fee for the second territory is $50,000. So essentially, there's a $10,000 savings when you commit to that second location up front, right? And then the third location may go down to 45,000, and then 40,000 for the fourth, and then a lot of times it kind of evens out, right? So if you're doing 5 or more locations, then using this example, maybe it's 35,000 per, right? Some brands will kind of give you the discounted rate across all of them. For example, I had a great candidate that I worked with last year, and while this is not typical or normal, she opted to secure 16 locations or 16 licenses for the franchise that she invested in. If I remember correctly, the way the franchise fees were structured on that particular brand, it was 35,000 per license or per territory for 5 or more, right? So because she did 16, they kind of grandfathered in the first 5 territories to be at that same $35,000 franchise fee, right? So essentially she paid 35,000 for each of the 16 licenses or territories that she acquired. Some brands don't necessarily do it like that. It would be 60,000 on the first, 50,000 for the second, 45,000 for the third. But hopefully you get the kind of gist, right? There is some economic savings if you commit to multiple upfront. Whereas if you said, hey, I'm just going to start with one, I'm going to get that first location open. We'll see how it goes. If things are going well and I decide that I want to do a second location, and you came back at a later time to secure that second territory or that second license, then the franchise fee would still be the $60,000 again. So, if we're talking 2 or 3 units, in the grand scheme of things, the savings alone on the initial franchise fees is usually not reason enough for someone to commit to multiple locations. I would say the ability to secure prime territory and kind of protect your ability to scale is a far more important reason that people would opt to go the multi-unit development route. But wanted to kind of walk you through what the savings on the franchise fees typically look like. And kind of going hand in hand with that, the third reason that you see, people securing multiple territories is that, multi-unit ownership is going to allow you to scale. Like one of the things I really try to get people to understand as we start working through this process together, evaluating different types of franchises, is just the different types of business models that are out there. If you're looking at a business that's more service based, right? So the franchise my wife and I own, Shelf Genie, we do custom pull out shelving and custom closet systems. So, we don't have a customer facing location. We have a warehouse with some office space, and that's kind of, our operation center, if you will. But, we go to our customers with our products and our services. And so in our particular case, we own 2 territories, right? We're coming up on 8 years that we've been in business as Shelf Genie franchisees. And in those 8 years, we've been able to consistently grow our business year over year without getting to a point where we felt like we had maxed out what we can do in the 2 territories that we own. It's still the same 2 territories that we started with. So, just the kind of the nature of a lot of these more service-based, territory-based models, you're not going to have as limited of an upside in terms of how much you can continue to scale the business over time without having to go back and buy more territory. Whereas if you look at the brick and mortar models, right, and I'll use a Pilates studio as an example again, you can fairly accurately calculate, what is the maximum amount of revenue a single studio can generate? What's the ceiling per location, right? Because that location's only going to be open a certain number of days out of the year. You're only going to be able to have a certain number of classes run per day that the studio's open, and you're only going to be able to have a certain number of clients or members per class, right? So you can kind of run the best case scenario, like if we fully max this thing out, what's the ceiling? And so, a lot of the types of people that are investing in franchises, and particularly brick and mortar franchises, which often lend themselves to more of an executive ownership approach, meaning the franchise owner does not need to work full time in the location. They're often kind of set up to be manage the manager models. The types of people that are typically attracted to these types of franchises, they don't want to be limited in how much they can grow the business. They want to ensure that they're able to continue to scale. And so, with a brick and mortar model, the way you scale the business over time is you open additional locations. And this is very, very common. Look at any of the big food franchises out there. You're not going to find someone that owns just one or two McDonald's. In the case of brands like McDonald's, it's really, for the most part now, private equity backed organizations that are big, large, multi-unit franchisees. But even using some of the examples from earlier, like Orange Theory or Club Pilates, you're not going to find very many franchisees that own just a single location. You're going to see a lot of franchisees that own 2, 3, 4 locations, and then you'll see some that have scaled beyond that, to 8, 10, 15, 20 plus locations. And in most cases, when someone gets to that point, right, if they own 10 or more locations, not always, but in most cases, they did not start, by committing to developing 10 locations. That certainly does happen. I gave you the example of the lady that I worked with that's, doing 16 locations. She committed to that out of the gate. But I would say more often than not, when you see a larger multi-unit franchisee, they probably started with the rights to develop 3 or 4 locations. After they developed those locations, things were going well. They decide to continue to expand, and because at that point they're seasoned operators, they really understand the business. They understand what success looks like. You'll often see a growth strategy that's a combination of continuing to open new locations, as well as acquiring, often underperforming locations from other franchisees, or franchisees that are just ready to take their chips off the table and divest from the business. Franchisees that had some life change that's requiring them to get out of the business. So that's fairly common. But the point is scalability, right? Multi-unit ownership leads to scalability, especially in brick and mortar models. All right. And then the fourth reason, and again, this kind of goes hand in hand, but the fourth reason you see people, planning for multi-unit ownership right out of the gate is that they understand, as you open more locations, especially if those locations are, kind of in the same region or, same market, if you will, you're going to gain operational leverage. All right. Operational leverage is just mean that as you add locations, certain costs and resources can be shared across all of those locations. So a very common example would be, I'll use the Pilates studio example again here. If you own 3 or 4 Pilates studios in the same kind of general market, over time, you can get to a point where, let's say you have one general manager or regional manager that kind of oversees all 4 of those locations. And then each location has maybe an assistant manager of some sort. The Pilates instructors that you would hire can potentially rotate across those 3 or 4 locations. So, some of your fixed expenses, in the case of like a Pilates studio in particular, to your payroll, at the management level, can be spread across those locations that you own. So over time, those operational efficiencies, some of those shared costs, are just going to put you in a position to have a stronger bottom line in the business. It's just going to help your margins improve over time. All right, so those are some of the pros, the reasons that people do opt for multi-unit ownership right out of the gate. Some of the cons, right? Of course, there's trade-offs, and I would not sit here and tell you that one strategy is particularly better than the other. As I kind of mentioned earlier, a lot of it depends on the individual. It depends on your risk tolerance. It depends on the amount of capital that you have. It depends on the confidence that you have in the brand that you're investing in, and a lot of it also depends on your long-term goals and your vision and what it is that you're trying to create through the business that you own. So some of the cons typically would be, obviously it's a higher upfront cost, right? The way these multi-unit development agreements typically work, this is a common um, question is, again, if you're securing the rights to develop 3 locations up front, does that mean you need to have the capital all up front to develop and open 3 locations? The short answer is no. And I'll get into a little bit more of that here in just a second when we kind of walk through what does a typical development timeline look like for multi-unit development. But you would need to have all of the franchise fees up front. So if we go back to that example from earlier, where you have a $60,000 franchise fee on the first location, 50,000 on the second, 45,000 on the third, that's a total of, I think, 155,000. Not great at math off the top of my head, so don't quote me on that. But let's say it's 155,000 for the franchise fees. You would need to have that amount up front in order to go ahead and secure those 3 locations. Whereas if you were just going with 1 location to start, it would just be the $60,000 in initial franchise fees. So that's a consideration. However, if say the total investment range for the franchise you're looking at is $350,000 to $500,000, that's going to include the initial franchise fee. That's going to include any of your startup and build out costs, right? So any of the costs associated with actually getting the franchise open for business, plus enough working capital on hand to run and operate the business until realistically you've had enough time to get the business to a point where it's positively cash flowing and can cover its own operating expenses going forward. If that investment range is $350,000 to $500,000 and you're doing 3 locations, you don't need that 350 to 500 times 3 up front, right? And again, I'll go into that a little bit more here in just a second, but I want to kind of round out the conversation on some of the cons of multi-unit development ownership. So the second big consideration is the development obligation, right? So a multi-unit development agreement with most franchises is typically going to include a development schedule that outlines when each location must open. Okay. So, this is not the type of thing where, you can come in and secure 3 locations and say, hey, I love to get my first location open ASAP, but then, I'll open the second one when I get around to it or when I feel like it. And maybe that's 2 years down the road or 3 years down the road. And, that third location, I'm just going to kind of, that's in my back pocket. And, probably be good to open it at some point, but I'm in no rush. The franchisor has to look at their territory as an asset, right? It's inventory for them. So, franchisors, especially in most of these brick and mortar models, they want people, as franchise partners that want to scale, right? That want to continue growing their business over time, but they don't want their dirt, if you will, right? Their territories just sitting there stagnant for longer than they should be. So again, they're not going to expect that you are opening 3 locations all at once. However, they are going to want to have some established timelines up front so that there's good expectations on both sides of this as to, all right, if you're planning to develop 3 locations, what does our timeline look like? When can we expect to have all 3 of those locations open and operating? Because if those territories are kind of sitting there in a sold status, meaning no one else can come in and buy them, but they're also not actively being developed within a reasonable timeline, that's kind of just wasted dirt for the franchisor. So that's a consideration, and that's important for people on the buyer side to understand, right? Where are the franchisors coming from? Because that's going to help you, just kind of better understand the whole dynamic that's at play here. So there is a development schedule that you need to make sure you understand and make sure you feel like you're comfortable with that. Now that being said, and I can't speak for every franchisor, but what I would say is that in my personal experience, I've certainly seen instances where, I mean, COVID was a good example with the pandemic and everything going on. I've seen examples where the franchisor was willing to work with the franchisee and extend the development timelines, because the franchisee was doing everything in their power to stick to the development timeline and get that second or third location open within the timeline that was agreed to. But external forces, things outside of their control, were preventing them from being able to do that. So again, I can't guarantee that'll be the case with every franchisor. I can't speak for any specific franchisor, but I've seen it where as long as the franchisor feels like the franchisee is doing everything they can to stick to that development timeline, they're going to work with them. Usually someone understanding that, feeling good about that relationship between the franchisor and themselves as the franchisee, gives them a little more confidence that the development timelines are going to be manageable. But it's something to understand for sure. You don't want to commit to multiple locations and not understand what that development timeline and that expectation looks like. We'll get right back to the episode, but I wanted to quickly share a free resource with you. If you're curious about franchise ownership and want to learn more about how countless people, including myself, have leveraged franchising as a way to create more freedom for themselves and to take control of their livelihood, I've put together an ebook. It's called Franchise Wealth Creation, and it's the perfect starting point for anyone that's just curious to learn more about this whole franchise thing and how I've helped hundreds of other people navigate all the steps involved in understanding and researching franchising. So click the link in the show notes, fill out a short form. I'll send you the ebook. I think it's a great starting point if you're curious at all about learning more about franchising. All right, let's get back to the episode. So the other con, right? So we've got, higher upfront costs and the initial franchise fees. You've got, some obligations in terms of the timeline to develop the locations. I'd say the third big con here for some people, not for everyone, is just it is a different risk profile, right? If you're committing to 3 locations out of the gate instead of 1, you are betting that the first location is going to go well. Right. And I say betting, if you go through the research the right way, it shouldn't be a bet. It's not a gamble or a roll of the dice. If you conduct the due diligence the right way, you should have a very clear understanding of what the pathway to success looks like, how the franchisor is going to help their franchisees achieve success in their model. And you should also have a very clear understanding of what does the franchise owner need to do in order to be successful, right? Any franchise you could ever research is going to have a bell curve in terms of franchisee performance, right? You're going to have top performers, underperformers, and everything in between, right? So a big part of researching any franchise is what do those top performers do differently and what do they do better than everyone else that leads them to have so much success. And you should feel confident in your own abilities, right? That you can come in and execute, right? You can operate your business in a similar manner to the way those top performing franchisees are operating their business, right? And then obviously you need to feel confident in the business that the franchisor is in and the franchisor themselves, right? How they're going to support you as a franchisee. And so much of this is relationship based, right? Like this is the piece that, you can do all the research online. You can look at all the FDDs you want. You can crunch all the numbers that you want. But, at the end of the day, franchising is a partnership, right? And so you have to feel confident in the people behind the brand, the people that you're partnering with. So that should obviously be a consideration because it is a little bit of a different risk profile. Now, I will say, right, because this commonly comes up, Wes, what if I, commit to three locations? Location one goes okay, but not quite as great as I expected, or it takes a little bit longer, to get to where it's cash flowing, and I'm just not sure that at that point, I'm not sure that I would want to go on and open location number two or location number three. Most franchisors, I've seen exceptions to this, so don't count on this. You need to confirm, but most franchisors will allow franchisees to sell undeveloped locations or licenses. In some cases, that could be to another franchisee in the system. That could also potentially be to someone else that's not yet a franchisee but interested, but you already kind of own the rights or the license for the area that they're interested in. So there are some off ramps typically, right? If you commit to multiple locations but for one reason or another end up deciding that you do not want to pursue opening all of the locations that you own the rights to, there is typically the ability to sell that license or that territory to someone else. Again, I have seen exceptions to that, but I would say that is not the norm. The norm, from what I see, is that you would have the ability to sell those licenses. And I've seen all types of reasons that someone may decide they don't want to move forward with developing all of the locations that they own. I've seen people that were very, very successful in their first or second location, and then a life change of some sort happened, right? And they just got to a point where, hey, we can keep the ones that we have going because they're already established, but we're not in a position where we can, invest the time or the additional capital to go open the next location. But that is definitely something that should fall into consideration. So now let's kind of talk about typical development timeline, right? This is a piece that often confuses people, right? If I kind of alluded to this earlier, but if I'm committing to doing three locations, does that mean that I'm, looking for three different leases simultaneously to sign and managing three different build outs at the same time, and need the money to be able to fund all three of these at the same time? And the answer is no, you don't. Um, if you really wanted to, if you were motivated to, right, it could be an option. Again, kind of depends on the franchisor, but typically the expectation is that you're not going to develop multiple locations simultaneously. Most development agreements are going to include a staggered development schedule, right? As an example, a three location development agreement might look something like this. Year one, you're focusing on getting that first location open, right? And then sometime in year two, right? So, and I would say usually, what I most commonly see is that the first location has been open for, say 3 to 6 months before the franchisee is then going to go start looking for a lease to sign for their second location. And a lot of times the bank that would be funding location number two is going to want to see, again, like 3 to 6 months of positive cash flow from your first location. If they can see that, that's going to give them confidence in you as an operator, and that's going to make the funding for additional locations a lot easier and probably a lot quicker as well. So, year one is location number one. Year two, location number two. Year three, or maybe even year four, would be location number three. And again, the timelines are all laid out up front, so none of this should be a surprise after finalizing things and becoming a franchisee. You should have a very clear understanding going into it before you make a decision and commit what those timeline expectations look like. And again, I've seen plenty of examples where those timelines have been shifted a little bit due to external forces that the franchisee or the franchisor don't really have any control over. But typically most franchisors, they're going to want a brand new franchisee to focus entirely on getting that first location open, get a great foundation laid, really get their legs underneath them, get them to a point where it's operating smoothly, they're making money, and only then would they then want to, see the focus shift to opening an additional location? All right. So this phased approach is, great because it allows you to really grow strategically rather than, trying to launch everything at the same time and you're just scattered, especially, if this is someone that's a first time business owner, they're new to the business or the industry that the franchise is in. All right. So last piece I want to kind of hit on real quick is how the financing usually works. I've already kind of touched on this, but obviously this is a big consideration, and sometimes a big misconception I see. Where if someone's committing to 3 locations up front, they think they need the total amount of capital that would be needed to develop, open, and start operating all 3 of those locations up front. So in reality, the financing usually happens in phases, just like the development and the opening of the location. So initially, typically, you're going to need capital for 2 things: all the franchise fees for the development agreement, right? So if we go back to that example of 3 licenses or 3 locations using the franchise fee numbers I gave, that's 155,000 for the franchise fees. All right. The second thing is the build out and the working capital for the first location. All right. So again, I think my example earlier was like 350 to 500,000. Now that would include one of those franchise fees in that range if you're just pulling that range right out of the FDD. But so that would say, with the additional 2 franchise fees, you're looking at 450 some odd thousand up to, roughly 600,000 is kind of the total amount of capital that you would need access to. And then, a lot of that variance is going to depend on where you're opening the location, right? With any of these brick and mortar franchises, depending on what part of the country you're in, real estate costs are going to vary, construction costs are going to vary. So this is something that you're able to flesh out during the due diligence where, you're going to have a much better understanding of, hey, based on where I'm at, the type of real estate that's needed, am I closer to the high end of the estimated investment range that the franchisor gives, or am I closer to the low end or somewhere in the middle? I'll probably do another video about that because it's kind of a big topic and a big area I see people have questions on that probably needs a little more time. But the point is, you don't need the full funding to open 3 locations up front, even if you're committing to opening 3 locations when you initially sign the franchise agreement. So once location 1 is up and operating, financing additional locations often becomes easier. Again, assuming that first location is going well and the bank can see, a track record of positive cash flow. All right. So as a result of that, many franchisees are able to essentially fund locations 2 and 3, based off of the cash flow that their first location is getting. Not necessarily meaning that they're taking 100% of the profits and using those profits to pour into the second location, although that's certainly an option. But it's more just the proof of concept to the bank, the proof that you are a proven operator. It typically gets easier. So kind of in closing here, this is an important thing that people should be thinking about as they start evaluating different franchises, right? Multi-unit development agreements can be a very powerful way to build a scalable business in franchising. It can allow you to secure territory, reduce franchise fee costs, create operational leverage as you grow. But at the same time, it requires more upfront capital. It's a different level of commitment. And there needs to be a lot of confidence in the concept, the people behind the brand, as well as yourself to be a good operator. So my key takeaway from this is, committing to multiple locations does not mean that you're opening all of them at once or need all of the capital to do so. In most cases, it's a phased strategy that allows you to build a portfolio of locations over time. This is something I spend a lot of time discussing with the people that I work with and guide through this process, because as I say all the time, there's not a one size fits all approach to franchise ownership. So there's a lot of things that should be taken into consideration here. And this is a big part of the strategy that I work on with people as they're investigating different franchises. So hope this was helpful. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.